Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 6th SSP webinar of 2020. You are joining us for a discussion titled The Future of Preprints, Coronavirus as a Case Study. I'm Jeff Lang with the American Chemical Society, the chair of the SSP Webinars Working Group, and we're pleased you could join us today. In a moment, we'll get started, and you'll hear from our moderator and panelists. You'll be seeing the SSP splash screen as we start this session. Your phone will be muted automatically in consideration of our presenters and your fellow webinar participants. Please use the questions feature on the right-hand side to send your questions if you need to let us know that you're having technical difficulties. The moderator will review your questions and present them to the panelists. To help him, please specify to which presenter you'd like your question directed. Please also send in your questions as we go. They'll be addressed after the presentations. At the conclusion of today's session, you'll receive a webinar evaluation via email. We encourage you to provide feedback so that we can continually improve the SSP webinar program. You will also receive a link via the email to the recorded broadcast of this webinar and slides. Our moderator today is Jason Point, who's an active SSP committee volunteer and an experienced scholarly publishing executive with over 25 years of experience, mostly in journals publishing with Wolters Kluwer, Elsevier, and now at the International Anesthesia Research Society. Now I'll turn the webinar over to Jason so that he can introduce the panel and get us started.
Great, thank you very much, Jeff. Hi, I'm Jason Point, Publishing Director at the IARS. More researchers are posting preprints in more disciplines than ever before. This growth has prompted questions about the future of preprints, especially in health and medicine. What are the benefits of sharing early stage research? What are the potential risks? How do the risks compare to peer-reviewed articles, and are there ways to mitigate them? The emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic early this year set off an unprecedented surge in preprint submissions of related articles, as researchers around the world sought to share data and findings as quickly as possible to fight the virus. These circumstances created a real-world trial for the aforementioned questions. Today's panelists represent 4 key roles in the scholarly content ecosystem: author as content creator, preprint server as content host, peer-reviewed journal as content authority, and institution as content consumer. Our panelists today will be Lyle Ostro, Assistant Professor of Neurology in the Neuromuscular Division at Johns Hopkins, Shirley Decker, Content Director at SSRN, one of the largest preprint servers in the world, Theo Bloom, Executive Editor of the BMJ and a founder of MedArchive, and Kate Gabrowski, an assistant professor of pathology at Johns Hopkins and co-director of the Johns Hopkins Novel Coronavirus Research Compendium, a rapid review effort for pre and post-publication work on COVID-19. So each one of our panelists will give a brief presentation to be followed by a discussion and Q&A. As Jeff said, please submit your questions through the application, and we'll review them and present them at the given time. Thank you very much, and now on to Lyle.
Lyle, you may still be on mute.
And Jason, can you press play for the slides, or is it?
Certainly. Can you see them, Lyle?
Yeah, but I mean, so the slideshow format, or as opposed to the slide sorter, right? The thing in the bottom right.
Yeah, no, it should be on my screen. It's showing as that. Sorry.
There you go. Now it is.
All right.
Okay. So yeah, thank you. I'm excited to be a part of this today, and so I'm an ALS clinician and a researcher, and I'm just going to start off by giving kind of a perspective from the ALS world on preprints and how they can be helpful, and how we can address their risks. So next slide. So, and is that your arrow, boss? I think it is, right? Yeah, in the middle there. Jason?
I don't know. I'm not seeing an arrow bot.
No worries. So, it is amazing how connected our world is today, right? So if news happens anywhere in the world, I find out about it on my phone 2 minutes later. And the question is, can we use this interconnectedness? Can we use this, the fact that it's so easy to share and talk to each other and disseminate information in a way that helps us accelerate research and still is responsible and still does so in a way that preserves, peer review and this really central critical part of our scientific process where our colleagues and our peers are responsible for making sure that our observations make sense and are valid and are interpreted correctly. But the way we do that has been the same since times when, in essence, the only way researchers communicated was occasional phone calls or an annual research meeting. And a big part of this too is also understanding how we can train or teach consumers, our patients, the media to properly digest research when it's coming from these different kinds of sources. So next slide. And so, in ALS, this is a particular problem because, so ALS is a uniformly fatal disorder. And, all of my ALS patients, they're going to die from ALS. And, we really don't have very many treatments. And the ones that we have, they only slow the disease down a little bit. Now, there's been tons of research over the past 3 to 4 decades. And the unfortunate thing is that the laboratory research has not translated well to successful clinical trials. So we really have not been successful in bringing things forward. And we think one reason for that is that ALS is probably a whole lot of different diseases, a lot of different mechanisms, and perhaps our lab models are not designed as a one-size-fits-all. And we don't have good biomarkers to necessarily tell when a drug is doing what we think it's going to do in a patient, or who are the right patients to use a drug in. But because of this scenario, patients are desperate, and I understand why they're desperate. And the bad guys, I mean, there are so many snake oil salesmen in ALS that peddle things directly to our patients. And there also are tons of off-label treatments, some of which may in fact have some validity to them. So this is a big problem for us, and how do we address it, and how do we inform our patients, how do we inform other doctors? It's also a big problem because, forget about preprints, even just the best research conducted in the most rigorous way and reviewed by 47 different reviewers and published in a high impact journal, it's often a basic science or an early phase clinical trial result, and the media and the public don't necessarily understand the significance of that and how far it might still be from a treatment. So a lot of what we have to do is really teaching. Can you go to the next slide? So recognizing that we needed to do better at translation and that we really did not have sources for patient-based tissues and biosamples and that kind of stuff. Oh, go back one. You popped on me. Yeah. So we created this multi-centered tissue core funded by the Target ALS Association. A bunch of other foundations fund different parts of it. This is my acknowledgement slide at the beginning. Many different academic centers are involved in this effort. And if you go to the next slide. And so our goal is to provide post-mortem, tissues from the tremendous patients who are making the ultimate donation for this research. We do all sorts of genetic analysis. Everything is combined with clinical data and neuropathology and quality control measures and the genomics, and it's all linked together. And we do this in a way that makes it available to researchers, all the data and all the samples, as quickly and openly as possible. Next slide. And importantly, we don't want anything for this. So, this is an effort where the researchers, they have full ownership, authorship. There's no IP requirements, no authorship requirements. And we really want to say yes to everybody. So when people, we have a request form for data, a request form for samples, and we don't say no. But by not saying no, what that means is that we work closely to really make sure that the experiments that somebody's planning are going to work, that they're feasible, that their assays work. And whenever possible, we use this as an opportunity to facilitate collaborations, other groups working in the same areas, find ways to, rather than duplicate work or get preliminary discovery data, maybe somebody else already has that. And it's really working out well. So as an example, just in, at the bottom there, in the past 3 years, we've helped support by providing samples and data to over 200 different research projects around the world. That's just actually for tissues. For the genetic data, there's 70 institutions in 15 different countries that are using our genetic data. And because of the way that we do this so openly and without any ownership and to foster collaboration, several large collaborative projects have grown out of this. Next slide. And so as an example, this was one of these early papers that was published when we started this effort. And the science, I'm not going to explain the science, but this was a discovery that these things called endogenous retroviruses, which are anthropologic remnants in your DNA, they're not an infection, they're not a virus. But in some patients with ALS, they may become activated. And when this paper was published, there were several pharma companies that came to us because even though these things are not an infection, they might respond, this mechanism might respond to drugs that are used to treat HIV. And so these pharma companies said, hey, we want all your samples and all your data because we're going to analyze them ourselves to see if our, HIV drugs might work. And we realized that if we did that, it would destroy our effort because we'd have nothing left. And so instead, next slide. Instead, we actually got two of the foundations involved in this effort to fund a centralized effort where we basically did this analysis of these endogenous retroviruses centrally in a highly curated way as quickly as possible by people who really knew how to do this and analyze the data, and then made that all freely, openly, broadly available. So next slide. And one of the people who was involved in this work is Molly Hamill. So Dr. Hamill's lab at Cold Spring Harbor, she's an expert in these retro elements. She's also an expert in analyzing this kinds of RNA data and figuring out what it means. And, so she started off this project helping us with this one specific, very focused area about retro elements. But in fact, when she analyzed the data, what we found using the tools that she has, and by the way, they're tools that she makes openly available, was that our patient samples, all of our autopsy specimens, they clustered. And there were different patients who had different flavors of ALS in their tissues. And this is really important because maybe it suggests that different treatments should be tried for different patients, or, some of these things might determine whether somebody progresses really quickly or really slowly. And so this was, a preprint with this data. All the data was made immediately available, the raw data, and a preprint showing this cluster analysis was put up last year. And next. And quite remarkably, literally the same day that preprint went up, we got requests for this data based on this preprint and for samples for other researchers who had ideas, because if you have a particular target that your drug might go after, this data might help you figure out which patients you want to use that drug in. And so I was literally sitting at a different meeting and got this request from a pharma company, and the request literally said, we would like to reproduce the results published in this preprint. And within 2 weeks, this is what had happened. So there were 3 other groups who had taken this raw data and reanalyzed it themselves to make sure that it was true. And this happened really quickly. And then there were several other groups who specifically wanted us to find samples for them or slides from specific clusters of patients. And so we went and annotated all of our samples and all of our data based on this. And this is all happening before this is now a published manuscript, but before it was even published. And it happened so quickly that this was just last year. There are now multiple ongoing projects around the world looking at this area of science. There's 2 early phase clinical trials that were inspired by this work. And so go to the next slide. Oh, actually go back for one other thing I want to mention. So Dr. Hamill actually got an award from the Chan Zuckerberg Science Initiative and to carry some of this forward. And Chan Zuckerberg is one of these funders in our space that have decided that they are only going to fund people if they agree to publish their results in preprints. So next. Now, I said I was at another meeting. The other meeting that I was at when this preprint came out was this meeting of a different consortia called the CREATE Consortia. And this is another group that collects biofluids and clinical data and longitudinal data on patients to track them over time and see if there's things we can measure in their blood that might, correlate. And the reason I was there was because this other consortia had taken all of our data, which we give openly and freely, and had been one of these groups that had reanalyzed it and reanalyzed what was in that preprint. And I was there for that presentation. And then when my email started lighting up with these requests for the data, And actually, some of these people were at this meeting, including that one pharma company. And I went to them and said, what are you doing to me? What do you, what's going on? And they basically said, yeah, everyone in the back of the room, we all just got this paper and everybody's talking about it together. And it was quite an invigorating thing to see how this could work. Now, why was I there? I was there because we were setting up a pre-competitive consortia to combine what Create has, these longitudinal biofluids, with what we were doing with the tissues. And this involved a bunch of pharma companies and was done openly. And next. And the reason we were doing this was specifically to figure out, so there's a lot of potential biomarkers in ALS, things we can use to track response to treatments, things we can use to cohort select, and make prognostic predictions about how patients are going to do. And we needed to get them over the finish line because we needed to be able to use them in clinical trials so that we could stop having clinical trials that fail and start being more successful in the way we run these trials. So what we did was we took all the samples from this Create consortium, which collects all of these biofluids longitudinally over time. We took a huge sample set. We found every CRO that runs every assay for the most promising biomarkers that were closest to being validated. We contracted with every CRO for every commercially available assay, and we sent them all the exact same sample set. And we were doing this because to use them in clinical trials, this is the information you need, right? And this information has to be broadly and openly available to everyone so that a planned clinical trial can know which assay is the best to use, which is going to work across multiple centers. And that was this preprint that came out late last year using neurofilaments and providing this data. And and immediately we also put the data in Data Dryad, so anybody that wants to can go find that raw data and publish it. This, of course, now has also been published as a full manuscript in the interim. Next slide. But because we were able to do this via preprint and so quickly, it has been taken up. And certainly there's a lot of other work on neurofilaments. These are 2 companion reviews that just came out talking about this work and others, and how these studies are going to help us conduct trials faster and with less patients and with more validity in ALS research. And just yesterday, I just did a search, and there's 25 studies right now on clinicaltrials.gov that are using neurofilament as an endpoint. Next. And one of the things about ALS I mentioned is that we really need to educate our patients, not just about preprints or how to read papers, but because there's so much out there that they need to understand how to digest. We have an organization that was started by Rick Bedlack called ALS Untangled. Patients tweet at us like ideas that they want us to review, off-label therapies. We have a standard way that we do so and a table of evidence, and these all get published in a peer-reviewed journal. They all get put up online. And it's a way for us to help educate not just patients, but providers out there who have patients bringing to them all this stuff that they find, whether it's in a preprint form or a website of a company, and say, what is this? Can I take this? Is this something that's useful? Next slide. And I think, and this is the last slide I have, and I want to just really, really stress this because, when people talk about, oh, preprints are good, preprints are bad, it's terrible that, the press is gathering this stuff. I mean, once upon a time, everybody moved around in horse-drawn buggies, and I can pretty much guarantee you that the first people who drove cars crashed them all over the place and probably killed a lot of people. And I don't know when driver's ed started, but I know my 16-year-old kid just took it, and I'm damn glad that he did. And I think every kid in the country does it, right? And so, the trick is, how can we educate people? I mean, cars get people where they're going a lot faster. Things like preprints, things like sharing information openly can help us accelerate science if we do so responsibly. The Northeast ALS Consortium, and again, Rick Bedlack and some sponsorship from the ALS Association, has a program called a Clinical Research Learning Institute, where it's a 2-day course, and we basically do these. There's an annual meeting where they're done. There's also regional ones. That picture at the bottom was one I was faculty for in Philadelphia at the ALS Hope Foundation. But it's a 2-day course, and it teaches patients how are clinical trials conducted, how is research conducted, how do you read a research paper critically, how do you read, a preprint critically, and it is a curriculum, and I'll tell you, it works. And you might say, oh, that sounds like a lot of work, and you're only got a room of 20 people each time, or whatever it is. But that bottom right corner, what that's showing you is what these research ambassadors, so they get certified, they get trained in they become what are called research ambassadors, and then they go out in their communities and they teach other people. And I'll tell you what, we might say, oh, patients misunderstand the data and don't know how to use this preprints. patients and their families and their caregivers are some of the most motivated learners, and the people who want to work the hardest to accelerate research. They are the best of the best. And that bottom right there is showing you what our research ambassadors have done. They've gone out and they have then, exponentially helped to educate the community. And this is really what's key, so that we can learn and help teach the media and help teach everyone, how to understand science and how to understand the information that's presented in these different formats. And that's it.
Okay, thank you, Lyle. Next up is going to be Shirley.
Hi, everybody. I'm Shirley Decker. I'm the content director at SSRN, and I'm representing the perspective of the preprint server. Next slide, please. SSRN is a early stage research platform. We were founded in 1994 by some economics professors. And in the first couple of decades, mostly focused on social sciences, law, economics, and so forth. In 2016, we joined with Elsevier. And in the time since that, we have been expanding to take our platform and the useful services that it provides and make it available to disciplines in other areas like physical sciences, applied sciences, and so forth. Next slide. One of the things we do is we do host a space that's dedicated specifically to medical research. We call it our Medical Research Network. And we offer spaces on our site to our partner journals, such as The Lancet, where a journal who wants to have a preprint space that's branded, that's specific to the kind of papers that are submitted to their journal, can do so on our site. And we offer this to Elsevier journals and also non-Elsevier journals. Next slide, please. We did a little research here. I did this with my colleagues here at Elsevier and looked at just the growth of preprints across the disciplines. And we found that in this period we looked at from May to May, rough estimate, it seems that preprint postings have been growing by 57%. So huge, huge growth. A lot of that growth is happening in social sciences and physics, which is where they've historically been a significant part of the way those disciplines share their research. But interestingly, we saw a lot of growth, particularly noteworthy in life and health sciences. And you can see that the blue numbers show the actual numbers, and then the orange numbers show the percentage of all of the preprints that are out there. We have a couple ideas. There's probably a lot of things that are driving that growth. There's definitely some of this growth is encouraged by the pandemic. We see across research and even in journals in particular that some people during the pandemic have a different type of time free and they are doing more publishing. And so that's part of it because we're seeing that in preprints. There's just an uptake in the kinds of paper submissions we're seeing. And I think a lot of researchers are taking their energies and seeing if they can help apply them to fighting the pandemic. Next slide. We've also seen a lot of new players and participants in the preprint space. In the 90s, all the preprint platforms were nonprofits led by researchers and universities. And in the last 5 years, we've seen over 30 preprint servers launched. The top 10 publishers, academic publishers now, are very vested in preprints with their own preprint servers. We see a lot of funders that have been mentioned who are writing significant grants to support current preprint servers. And we're seeing things like societies starting their own preprint servers. Next slide. When I'm deciding if a restaurant is good, one of the strong things I look for is to see if other people are interested in that restaurant. Is there a long line in front of this restaurant every time I go by? And when I think about one of the things we're asked to talk about is, what are the benefits of preprints for COVID-19 research? I sort of have the same approach. If there are a lot of authors who are posting their research as preprints, and if there are a lot of researchers reading and downloading those preprints, then to me that indicates a real felt demonstrated benefit. And that's exactly what we see happening with COVID-19 preprints. Next slide, please. This is coming from a really interesting study that just came out a couple of months ago. And two of the key points that I think it makes nicely is this, reader and author interest. So author interest, 40% of all COVID-19 literature to date has been posted via preprints, and that's indicated by that figure B. 40%, that's a huge percentage. And you can see that it's been growing as, unfortunately, the cases of COVID have been growing. When we look at the reader interest, we see in this study, they looked just at MedArchive and BioArchive, that the COVID-19 preprints were downloaded 30 times more than non-COVID preprints on the same site. So there's a demonstrated utility and interest in the community that's doing research in this area. Next slide. And this is quite significant from even recent years. So this study shows that there were less than 5% of the Ebola and Zika journal articles that were posted as preprints prior to publication in journals. So even in previous epidemics, when there was a strong interest in quickly sharing research, preprints were not used as much. They've been embraced much more now with this current pandemic. Next slide. On SSRN, we've got biomedical COVID-19 preprints around 1,800. We're also, because we're such an interdisciplinary platform, we have a lot of other content that is related to COVID-19. It's looking at public health concerns, economic concerns, and we have almost 4,000 papers on that topic. All of these were obviously posted since January. And that research is being read. Since the beginning of the year, we've had 1.3 million downloads of this content. And we're seeing that this content is having 2 to 4 times higher engagement than our average, the rest of our content on our site. So the researcher interest is there and it's being used. Next slide. So I live just north of Boston and I love eating oysters. Is there a potential danger to eating oysters? Well, yeah, there are bad oysters out there. There can be red tide. Maybe they aren't refrigerated well. So when I want to eat oysters, I take some steps to mitigate my risk. I sniff the oysters before I eat them. I only get oysters, raw oysters, from restaurants or markets that I have a reason to trust. It's a buyer beware situation, right? You'll get a bad oyster from time to time. Is there a need to mitigate the risk of eating oysters, and really all seafood for that matter? Well, yes. Just like there is a need to mitigate the risk in preprints and medical preprints, and really all research, needs to have some element of mitigating risk. But that doesn't mean that you don't share the research quickly, and it doesn't mean that you don't eat oysters. Next slide, please. Two of the ways that we try to mitigate the risk at SSRN is through screening and cautionary language. So we have a basic paper review process, and we've added 2 additional steps to the screening that we do for medical content. The first one is done by SSRN staff, where they're looking for conflict of interest statements and so forth. The second is done by an outside expert with an advanced degree in the medical field, and that's looking more for scientific reliability, making sure it's not going to be harmful to public health and safety. And then the language here is an example. We've got cautionary language in multiple places on our site. This is an example of one of those instances. Next slide. So part of the question is the future of preprints, and my view is I think preprints are here to stay. I do think that there are questions that need to be explored further, and this is a list just of the things that are top of my mind when I think, what next for medical preprints. But it's questions that are more about refining how we do it, not whether or not we're going to be doing it. And when I was thinking of this image came to mind. This is sort of a classic agile product development visual. And the idea, I didn't know I was going to talk about transportation, but the idea is if your goal is to have transportation, to get from one place to another, there can be iterations in how you develop the way that you're going to make that movement. And you can iterate. If your real goal is maybe you want to get to the car, you might iterate, and first, you try a skateboard and then you turn it into a scooter, and you kind of add features and so forth. And so when I think about medical preprints, I might say maybe we're at scooters, and maybe we as a scholarly communication community, want to think about that scooter and what are those features that we need to add or adjustments to make it maybe more like a bicycle. And maybe we think of the version of record as the car. Or maybe we think of the version record as the motorcycle because we still want to be continuing to evolve how we communicate research and what is really the best. Another thing I like about this image is that sometimes you want a car, sometimes you want to ride a bike, sometimes you might prefer a skateboard. I do believe that each of these iterations, these ways of sharing scholarly research, can have value in and of themselves as long as you know what they're there for. So next slide, please. So when I think about the future of preprints and their role in furthering research, well, this is Union Oyster House in Boston. It's one of the oldest oyster houses in the world, or in the country, I should say. And whether you get there by foot or scooter or bicycle or car, the oysters are always delicious. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Shirley. Next up is going to be Theo Bloom. Theo, take it away.
Hi, thanks, Jason. Yeah, I'm Theo Bloom. I'm executive editor of the BMJ. Next slide, please. But in this context, it's also relevant that I'm a co-founder of the MedArchive preprint server and continue to be an editorial advisor there. I think maybe the pandemic is helping us be clearer about the roles of journals and preprint servers, but we'll see in the discussion. So MedArchive, Shirley mentioned, is one of the newer preprint servers and is specifically designed for health science preprints. For those who know, it's bioRxiv, which was founded at Cold Spring Harbor for biological research. MedArchive is basically a clone, and it's a not-for-profit service run out of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, but managed in partnership with BMJ, who I work for, and Yale University. And basically, BMJ, we bring some expertise in clinical research assessment and editorial concerns, as do our colleagues at Yale, who also great on the academic outreach. We launched just over a year ago and are now supported by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Next, yeah. So conversely, the BMJ, which is my paid job, if I can put it that way, my day job, is very old. Has existed, since the 1850s, and has transitioned from being a print magazine to being, of course, an online journal first and foremost. But it has a long history of sort of campaigning and investigating what's going on in health, as well as publishing research, all of which is open access. Next slide, please. And we, like other publishers, so BMJ publishes around 70 journals, including the BMJ. And like other publishers, we've been gathering together all our coronavirus output, making it all freely available. And we've probably seen, 2 to 4-fold increase in what's been submitted and what the output that the speed at which we're putting out articles in the pandemic. And in return, we're giving it away free, which as a publishing audience, you may understand is a problem for us. Next slide, please. So conversely, MedArchive, which also gives everything away free, when I looked on Friday, we were at nearly 7,000 COVID preprints, and that compares with a few hundred journal articles that we've published at BMJ. And I think that question of what proportion of things become peer-reviewed articles and how quickly is going to be a really interesting one to observe as we get through the pandemic. Next slide, please. So just to talk about growth for a minute, we saw a literal 10-fold increase in submissions over a 3-month period from late January to late April. Yeah, more than 10-fold. And the amount we posted went up a similar amount. We are seeing a decline from that immediate rush to get everything out as quickly as possible, but we're sort of stabilized now at a steady rate. And that grows quite a lot faster than our sibling bioRxiv, as you might expect, given the timing of when we launched. Next slide, please. So MedArchive, like what Shirley was saying for SSRM with health preprints, we want to make research available as quickly as possible, all the reasons Lyle was talking about, but also to do no harm and to avoid health panics and scares or harm to individual patients, of course. So our basic requirements are that things are original clinical research, we don't take commentaries and essays and so on, and that they follow the basic reporting standards of the field as manifest in the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors guidance. Things like having an ethical oversight statement and saying where the data are available if they are. And it turns out that those basic requirements are most of the reason why we end up turning things away. Either they're not original research, or if they are, they don't have adequate ethical oversight or something like that. Very rarely do we turn things away because we're worried about causing a panic or a scare. But of course, that's what our safety nets exist for. Next slide, please. And so that risk mitigation starts with those author undertakings, the author telling us that they have done their research in the right way. Of course, we're taking that on trust. There are a number of automated checks for things like plagiarism, staff at Cautionary Harbour who check, is this a research article? MedArchive, like bioRxiv, has affiliate scientists, researchers who check, does this appear to be a research article in my field? And if any of those areas turns up a concern, there's an escalation. We have an experienced clinical editor who looks at everything before it goes live, but also, again, things can be escalated to the MedArchive leadership where we discuss and make policy about article types and so on. And then things are posted and there is public discussion, and that is a part of the risk mitigation, is that people discuss and the preprints that are wrong usually get withdrawn pretty quickly if they're profoundly wrong. So in essence, we're always asking, is this something for which there's a benefit to sharing rapidly, or is the risk such that it's better that it's shared after peer review? Next slide, please. And some people have said that sounds a lot like peer review, all those steps. MedArchive screening takes 2 or 3 days, and this is an outline of the peer review process at the BMJ, includes academic reviewers, a number of editors looking at things, patient reviewers, we have specialist statisticians for statistical articles, and when it's expedited, this review process can take a couple of weeks instead of a couple of days. But it really is not the same thing as preprint screening. And I think increasingly people have recognized the difference between a formally peer-reviewed journal article that they can place some trust in and a preprint which they should treat with the skepticism of, as some people say, just the latest PDF that someone is circulating. Next slide, please. So I have an example of why I think preprints are both important, but then superseded by journal articles. So in the UK, a large clinical trial of COVID called the Recovery trial, looking at treatments and therapies, came up with the finding that dexamethasone was helpful. And the first that anyone knew of this was a press release issued by the government saying you should now be prescribing dexamethasone to certain categories of patients. That was on the 16th of June. If you click, please, Jason. That came as a preprint a couple of days later. So at the time it was press released, it was not yet a fully written up research article ready to be even preprinted, but it was posted a little less than a week later, and people could at last look at the data and assess the paper. And as you'll see, it's now published in the New England Journal. Next, Jason. And that was published, I think, a month after the initial preprint. So You might say, do those 5 or 6 weeks matter? Well, it appears that dexamethasone saves about 1/3 of the people who are on ventilators and 1/6 of those who are in hospital needing oxygen. At which point, how long do you want to wait? Conversely, do we want our leaders just telling us what drugs we should be prescribing on their authority? Next slide, please. This is really there just to highlight that there have been both good and bad outcomes of preprints, and we can't legislate that, but also good and bad about journal articles. The first results about hydroxychloroquine were posted as a preprint and appeared the next day in a journal article. Next. So I just want to emphasize that journals can do a lot of different things from preprints. They can synthesize and contextualize, and in our case, that involves things like living systematic reviews, which are continuously updated, rapid recommendations, which aim to get from published article to clinical guideline within 90 days, which is both slow and a lot faster than usual. Next slide, please. And I think Shirley said this already, that COVID is the first pre-printed epidemic. The graphs show a different version of the slide she showed about Zika and Ebola and so on, being the articles all coming out after the diseases had passed that wave of activity. The question is, how do we make all those thousands of preprints into useful information? And I think that's it from me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Theo. So our final panelist today is Kate Grabowski from Johns Hopkins, and Kate's going to talk about how an institution assesses and utilizes all of this content. Kate?
Sorry, Kate, you're muted, I think.
I am, thank you. Sorry, I was just saying thank you to Jason and the rest of the organizers of this meeting for the opportunity to be here today. I'm really pleased to be able to talk about the Johns Hopkins Novel Coronavirus Research Compendium, which is really a COVID-19 literature curation effort for public health professionals. So as many of you are aware, there have been, and as Theo and Shirley have described, there's really been a deluge of publications and preprints since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And for folks working on the front line in public health, it's been beneficial, but it's also made it really difficult to keep up with what is the most important emerging information. In addition, there is, the available evidence that's being put out in both preprint and in publication is of varying qualities, and it's often difficult for people who are not well trained to discern what is high quality from what's not. Folks also on the front lines have very little time to read the literature. And as I was mentioning, they just may not have the expertise to evaluate what's high quality and what's not. So, so initially we started the NCRC for short. If you can just go back, please, to the prior slide. Thanks. So initially, we started this this compendium because we were being asked by public health departments and by our colleagues at the School of Medicine to kind of summarize the emerging literature as it was coming out, and it was a really difficult task for any one or two people to do. So what we did was we gathered a group of our colleagues and we essentially sort of automated comprehensive searches of publications and preprints to identify evidence and 8 key topic areas, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And then the people who are part of our effort do expert reviews of these curated lists of papers with short and easy to read summaries and take-home points that are put on the website. So I just want to note again that our target audience are really people who are frontline public health professionals, and clinicians who are responding to the pandemic and don't have time to keep up with this huge surge of information. Next slide, please. So who are we? So we are greater than 60 J2 faculty, postdocs, and doctoral students at this point. We also have collaborating faculty from Imperial College, Boston University, Vanderbilt, and other institutions who have joined our effort. As I noted, we do reviews in 8 topic areas that we, that we decided at the beginning of this curation effort were of most interest to public health professionals working in health departments or working in government. And those areas include modeling, diagnostics, epidemiology, impact of non-pharmaceutical interventions, pharmaceutical interventions, clinical presentation and prognostic risk factors, ecology and spillover, and vaccines. Next slide. So how do we do this curation effort? So first, I just want to note that there's a lot of different curation efforts that are out there, some funded by the Chad Zuckerberg Initiative, and most of these efforts really just take all of the literature that's coming out, and then they bin it into like, okay, this is all the epidemiology literature, this is all the clinical literature. There's like topics, and they use keywords to kind of sort that literature. So what we do is different, and I'll describe in the coming slides how what we're doing is different from those other efforts that are largely being done through artificial intelligence algorithms. So the first thing that we did was we actually designed searches working with informationists at the Welsh Library at Hopkins. And these searches were unique for each of the different 8 topic areas that we are working in, and they're updated every once in a while. Our searches are then automated across PubMed and then also across the various preprint servers, including MedArchive and SSRN. We automatically pull what comes in from our searches into a web platform that's a Shiny application. And then the teams will go and look at what sort of popped up in each of their searches through this web platform, and then identify research that is original in nature and has novel findings and is likely to be of relevance to public health practitioners. So we're not covering commentaries, or in general, we're not covering reviews. We may cover a systematic review if it's getting a lot of press and it's in a really high impact journal, but I think we've only covered 2 total. And then, we will also cover studies that may not necessarily be novel or meet our criteria for what we think is really interesting. If it's receiving a significant amount of press and we think there might be misinterpretation of what was presented in that research by the general public. And I think really this is where we're different, and that we are using the opinions of experts and people who have expertise in the fields that we're working in to really identify what's novel. And so there is some subjectivity to what we do, but we think that is, that's the strength of our platform, not a limitation. Next slide, please. So, so this just gives you a sense of what our web platform looks like. If you're the different study groups, you just click on it, the papers pop up, and then the summary of the article or the abstract pops up. Next slide. And then at the bottom of this form, we are asking our teams to say, okay, does this fit within each of the 8 topic areas? They answer yes or no. Should it be assigned to a different group? It can get shuttled to one of the other 7 different groups if you don't think it belongs in your group. We ask them if it contains original research, and then critically we ask, is this manuscript relevant to practice-based public health audiences who are like at least has semi-technical expertise. So they might have an MPH, or they might be in managerial positions. Next slide. So once a paper makes it through this triage queue, and I'll show you what the results look like for how much comes into our platform and how much we ultimately end up reviewing. It's not a lot. We do these expert reviews, which are then posted on our website. And our reviews consist of a number of different areas. We do a summary of the study design, the methods, and the results, which is kind of similar in a way to an abstract, but might be a little bit more detailed. And we may pull out information that's not necessarily in the abstract that we think is of relevance to practice. We also really here focus on the limitations, the strengths, and what the value added is of the research. And I think this is what people find most useful when they're coming to our website. They don't need to just see a regurgitation of the results. They want to know, is this something that I can trust? And then ultimately we draft up a final take of our study. So what are their final conclusions about whether or not folks should trust it and what the most important take-home messages were. I'll note for preprints that we always, we have language where we always mark everything with with a sentence at the top that notes that it was a preprint and that it has not yet really been peer reviewed beyond what we're posting on our website. And so I will note that we talked about quality and how do we score quality in some of the previous presentations. And we specifically opted against doing quality metrics for our site, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. Next slide. So I just want to briefly mention that once our reviews, before our reviews get posted, they undergo a scientific editing process for technical content and to ensure that we're communicating at a level that our audience will understand. Next slide. And I just want to note that we've screened out over 30,000 articles, but we've only reviewed a total of 350 articles. You can see that about 30% of the articles that we're screening on the left-hand sides are coming from preprints. And about 30% of our reviewed articles are also preprints. And of these 30%, about 30% have now gone on to publication. The one thing I do want to note is that all the reviews that we do from MedArchive and BioArchive are actually linked onto their websites directly. So we worked with their teams to get a link to our reviews posted underneath the articles when we do reviews for them. Next slide. So there's a lot of different challenges you might imagine. There's a ton of literature. There's a huge scope and we have to identify what we can and can't cover. Funding for this endeavor is limited. There's a lot of technical details on the back end. Just getting people to review, as I'm sure everybody involved in publishing here knows, is really challenging. And then getting our reviews out once sort of controversial articles are out in the public and letting people know what folks think about those articles is often really difficult. And in general, just reaching our target audience has been a challenge. So, and the next slide's the last slide. So next slide. So in conclusion, there's just a massive amount of COVID-19 literature, including preprints. I think there's definitely a need to be able to distinguish high quality evidence. And that's probably the biggest challenge, I think, with preprints, but also in the post-publication literature. And really, this is going to require peer review from people with relevant expertise. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Jason.
All right, thank you very much, Kate. Thank you to all of our presenters today. I realize we don't have a ton of time for Q&A, but let's go ahead and see what questions we do have here. And I apologize, everybody, for the moving cursor. I was trying to balance between the webinar control panel and the slides until I realized that I couldn't do that without making everybody nauseous. So there's a quick question here for Shirley about SSRN, which I can actually answer. Is the preprint site only for medical journals? And the answer for that in the case of SSRN is know, SSRN covers other sciences and humanities. Really, medical is the latecomer to the game. So, Theo, there's a question here from Emily Marchant, asking if you could talk a bit more about withdrawal and retractions and when they are each used. I'm assuming this is in relation to something that maybe it has gone from preprint to final publication, and you could walk us back on the withdrawal and retraction going back to the preprint server.
So I guess, we talk about withdrawal of preprints because they haven't been formally published, and retraction of published articles because they have. And I guess we don't have that many examples of withdrawal of preprints, but those that I'm aware of have tended to happen within a very relatively short time after publication. There was one notorious one on bioRxiv in which authors who weren't very familiar with it claimed they saw a similarity between HIV and coronavirus and suggested this meant it was engineered in the lab. I'm not sure exactly what it said, but it was kind of nonsensical. But it was jumped on very quickly by the commenters and Twitter, and the authors withdrew it within about 2 days because they thought they wanted to go away and do more work. Conversely, we know there are notorious examples of journal articles that take decades to be retracted, even once they're known to be fraudulent, because people threaten journals with legal suits and so on. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but obviously there have been cases now where journals articles have also been withdrawn very quickly, I'm afraid. Some of the very high profile journals published some work early in the pandemic that has then turned out not to be reliable because the database they were built on is not what it was claimed to be, or at least no one could check that it was. And those, having been expedited publication, were also very quickly retracted. So I'm not sure if that answers the question.
I think it is addresses it as well as we can with the evidence available to us. Next is a question for Lyle, and this is something that I was wondering as well. If you could speak to, as an author and a researcher, how do you manage the competing tensions, or do you even view them as competing tensions, between making your data and research open and collaborating versus, from an advancement and promotion point of view, making the most professional benefit from your work? You're muted. Can we unmute Lyle?
Lyle, you're muted. Oh, you're still muted.
Now?
Okay.
Okay. Sorry about that. I think I'd be used to this by now. So, I gotta say this really baffles me. And with respect to preprints, once you put up a preprint, there's a permanent record of your work. So if anything, it kind of prevents you from getting scooped by somebody else, right? Because it's always going to be there. But the fact is, if you have something that you do that you're an expert in, that's your assay or your way of analyzing data, something that you're funded to do, it's to your benefit to show that other people are using it, right? And so if others take your data or your technique or your methods and run with it, well, that shows your funding agency or your institution or whomever it is, look, what I'm doing is important and it's being taken by the community. And so I think that once people jump on the team and start playing in the sandbox with us and say, okay, I'm going to share what I do or share my data, they find it's remarkable. We've been having these Zoom calls that everybody is so fond of since 2018, many times a week, because what happens around our resources is these collaborative teams form in real time every single freaking week. And the way we manage them is with these virtual lab meetings. And I got to tell you, you know, when you're a kid and you think about what science is supposed to be, like this is it, right? This is experts from all over the place talking to each other every week in this, you know, and actually in Zoom, it's hilarious, and figuring stuff out together. And when you talk about, you know, professional benefit, like what I want to do with my life is figure stuff out, right? And so I kind of feel like I'm living the dream, that the world is my lab, that, you know, it's incredible. It's an unbelievable experience. It's what science is supposed to be. So, you know, I really think those kinds of worries are unfounded. And particularly with preprints, I mean, having your data up there not only gives you, you know, is a permanent record, but if you're writing a grant for some novel new idea, almost all funding agencies, you know, NIH, they allow you to reference preprints now, right? So you can have your complicated methods or your preliminary data or whatever it is in a preprint. It's helpful.
Yeah,
Okay, great.
can I just make a quick comment? You know, I largely agree with Lyle. I think preprints and open data are really important and are the future. I will say that for those of us working in international research settings, it's been more of a challenge. And there are unique issues, I think, with dealing with different cultural expectations and different promotion review processes depending on what country you're in. And so I think when we're talking about these things, it's always really important to have people from a wide variety of settings outside of Europe and North America that may be working on science as well, and getting their perspectives on these issues, because I have found in my experience that they're not really uniform.
Good. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We are unfortunately out of time. I appreciate the participation of our panelists, and for our attendees, I very much hope that you got some new insights into preprints and their place in the future of medical publishing. Thank you very much. And
Thanks
Jeff?
once again from SSP here. Thank you, Jason, Theo, Kate, Shirley, and Lyle for the discussion today. Thank you also to our sponsor, Research Square, for their support, and our audience for attending. Please do take time to respond to the webinar evaluation when you receive it, and join us for the next SSP webinar, Moving Beyond Good Intentions, Creating a Diverse and Inclusive Community Through Commitment and Action, on Wednesday, October 22nd. Thank you so much and have a great day.